Today, we are thrilled to cross-pollinate with Dr. Bob Duke and Dr. Art Markman from KUT's popular podcast, Two Guys on Your Head, produced by Rebecca McInroy. Every week, they explore everyday things to help us understand our behavior. Today, we're going to examine how our connection to nature impacts our interaction with the garden and the natural world. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Should I call you doctors?
Bob, Art.
Bob, Art. All right. Well, I love it. I think the first pressing question that we've had is, why is my plant talking to me? And does that make me crazy? No, I'm just kidding. No, we wanted to step back and really talk about the concept of aesthetics and beauty here. Why do gardeners perhaps need a design or boundaries to find beauty in nature?
So much of what we think is beautiful is based in part on things we've seen before.
Okay.
And so we bring a set of expectations to almost anything that we encounter. As a result of that, those expectations then shape what we want to do next. And so when we encounter a garden, if we have a belief about what a garden should be, then we're going to be evaluating this garden on the basis of the reaction to that set of expectations.
Yeah, and I think anybody who's identified as a creative person, whether it's gardening or creating art or whatever, you know, often what that means is you have things in your memory that do create expectations about what's likely to be, and then you vary that in some optimal way. You know, when you see things that people say, I should pay attention to that, it's often not because it epitomizes what people think something should be like, but there's a little bit of a surprise in that, right? There's a little bit of something that's not expected that makes me think, wow, that's really interesting.
Is there a danger of that setting up a dichotomy, though, of good or bad, though?
Well, I think that any aesthetic is going to have its lovers and its haters, right? And so I think that there are these implicit value judgments that go into that, and I think that part of the interesting thing about being willing to examine a variety of aesthetics is that willingness to kind of tamp down the initial reaction you have to something and then go, oh, actually I see what they were doing there.
It's a pretty common human tendency that we make judgments really fast based on a little bit of information. And if you're thinking about something that you're experiencing for the first time, you think, well, how long can I hold my judgment in abeyance and not just right out of the gate say, that's good, I like it, that's not good, I don't like it. You know, when I take little kids to an art museum and there is contemporary art in there, so we walk up to something like in the Blanton, we see a pink octagon fabric pinned to the wall, you know, and a kid would go, what's that? It's not even art, you know. I said, well, just wait. And one of the things that I do with kids is I give them an alternative thing to say when they see something that's odd to them. So what I invite them to say is, when you see something, I don't understand that at all, say, that's interesting. I'll need to think about that some more. Now, when you hear an 8-year-old say that standing in front of modern art, you think, what a sophisticated young child. but actually, all I've done is just delayed the judgment making, right? I've just said, well, let's have an alternative to having to decide right away. And let's just experience this a little bit and see what happens. Because we might not think the same thing 5 minutes from now if I don't already get closure and say that's a good thing or a bad thing.
There's a lot of push and pull, especially with the creation of habitat and landscapes. Doug Ptolemy has written Nature's Best Hope, which is a New York Times bestseller, that talks about the only way we're really going to help save the environment and the world is if within our gardens we include about a third of habitat. Right, that has a collective impact. And there's a lot of push and pull because people see habitat creation as disorder or messy. And I'm wondering how we can start to approach that in a way where we evoke a new perception. And I like to call it sort of a creative unpredictability. I mean, because part of that's letting go. So how does one do that?
Well, so here's an interesting thing. Psychologists have talked about 5 basic personality characteristics that go by the acronym OCEAN, and the C in OCEAN is conscientiousness, which reflects how much do you need to complete the things you start, are you obliged to follow the rules from a personality standpoint. And the thing about being a gardener is it requires a fair amount of conscientiousness because gardens don't remind you of what they need. I've always said I can't keep anything alive unless it begs to be fed. And so you need that level of conscientiousness, which means you have an appreciation for the rules, you have an appreciation for things that have a particular order to them. And so many of the people who gravitate towards tending a garden as something that brings them a certain amount of peace have that characteristic, and And now you're putting that at odds with an aesthetic that says, I want you to be very conscientious in keeping this thing up, but make it look kind of a mess.
Yeah.
And that's
Right.
hard to do because it casts against type. And so one of the things you have to do is to recognize I can be very planful and very engaged with creating something that is itself not going to look regimented.
I think one of the challenges of changing your aesthetic, about seeing something that you normally would think of as a mess as interesting, is understanding more about what relationship it has to the rest of the environment. You know, I think the whole thing that you mentioned about habitat, you know, it's interesting because when you first said that to me earlier before we started taping, I thought, well, why would habitat necessarily be messy? You know what I mean?
Right.
Because I look at some places where I'll look at a marshland somewhere, you know, and I think, well, yeah, I mean, it's a little unkempt, but I mean, basically it seems like orderly and in a different kind of way, you know. And I think, you know, human beings, we have become masterful at controlling our environment, you know, and the idea of a sense of personal agency is a sense that I can actually act on the world and make it do my bidding, you know. But if you think about, well, what's the function of a habitat? What's the function of arranging whatever plants are growing here or whatever water features or whatever are here that are actually relating to insects and birds and other animals that might exist in this environment? Well, now you're looking at through that at a somewhat different lens. I mean, you're not just looking at it, does that please me visually as the first and only criterion, but are there things about this that I can appreciate because of how they interact with the bigger environment?
How can we look to foster, create a stronger relationship and acknowledge that these gardens are actually doing something that actually addresses other species?
Well, I think in part we have to come to recognize the value of wild things. So cities are very ordered.
Right.
They're planned,
Right.
at least to some degree. And really, I think there's a certain peace that sometimes comes with being in a more open space with a little bit less noise, or at least a little bit less manufactured noise. And so I think that we have to learn to reappreciate that again. And as we learn to reappreciate that, then to remember that it's not just the plants, but it's actually the entire ecosystem.
A piece to add to that is the importance of thinking about being a better noticer. When you see anybody who's really expert at anything, I mean, one of the things that distinguishes them is that they notice features of what they interact with that other people just wouldn't notice, you know. And I think a lot of times, you know, you see somebody say, how can anybody be interested in that? Because I'm not interested in it. And what you come to realize if you spend some time with somebody who actually is interested in that thing that you're thinking about, whether it's a garden or a book or whatever, is that they point out things that escaped your notice at first blush, you know? And I think one of the things about habitat creation, you know, when most people think about a garden, they really think about the plants. They don't think about insects necessarily, or about birds or butterflies or those kind of things, you know? And once you start to notice things like that, well, now a plant takes on a different kind of dimension, right? Because it's not just what colors the flower and what do the leaves look like and that kind of thing, but now it's actually attractive to this particular pollinator who wouldn't be in my garden unless that plant was there, right? And so now there's something more to notice about this than just the visual effect of having blue stuff over there and red stuff over there and green stuff over there.
Bob and Art, I'd like to thank you so much. I wish we could talk for like 8 more hours about this.